The Subcommittee on Energy and Environment reconvenes, and the chair will recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Hayes, I was not able to read your testimony before I left last night, and even though I started early this morning, 6:30, I didn't see it, so I heard your oral testimony. So, you did say in the written testimony, but not in your oral testimony, that the administration was not prepared to give their support for the bill. Is that right? So that's as it would be cleared by OMB.
That's correct, Congressman. That we do not have clearance from OMB to have an administration position on this bill at this time.
Okay. Now there are a good number of things, and there are a number of things in the bill that I support. I support the blowout preventer and the requirements that include the independent third party. And you all have the ability to require that now by regulation, right?
That's correct.
And what are the current regulations as it relates to the blowout preventer? Are there any regulations along this line?
There are some. There is a general regulation, and then some specifics in terms of types of, for example, systems that need to be in place in BOPs. For example, but it's more of a menu as opposed to much of a prescription. For example, there need to be, under the regulations, some redundancies, 2 types of redundancies, but there's not a prescription that it has to be a certain type of blowout prevention mechanism, like for example, acoustic devices can be used but aren't prescribed to be used. And what we're doing right now, Congressman, is essentially filling in what we think are gaps in those regulations under the 30-day report that we're now implementing.
It talks about, and of course we've had a number of hearings here, not only oversight, but as well as this subcommittee, and I read the detailed report by the oversight subcommittee, which I thought was very good. One of the things that came out in our hearing a week or two ago was that when we had the 5 CEOs come, that 4 of them indicated that they had the stop work requirements on their rigs, pointing out probably that BP did not take advantage of that. Is the Department of Interior looking at, in the absence of this bill, where are we on stop work provisions?
We are very interested in that point. I mean, we think it's an essential ingredient of any regulatory system that there be an understanding that if there is a risky situation that develops, that there is an obligation to take a conservative route and shut down. We're looking at that from a couple of different perspectives. We are finalizing some safety system regulations that have a similar type of effect. But quite honestly, we're going to look at what you all have put here in this bill and see whether we have a strong enough regulation underway to deal with it, because we certainly agree with the point. So we'll examine that further.
I have 2 questions I want to get to before my time expires. Have you all done what we call a side-by-side of what the rules and regulations are for offshore drilling in this country as compared to what UK and other countries overseas have done, in terms of pluses and minuses?
We started that process in connection with a 30-day report, and have a discussion in the 30-day report that provides essentially a fairly high-level analysis of that.
Could we get a copy of that? Or is
certainly,
that available?
Certainly, we'll be happy to give it to you. We want to do more of that. We want to have world-class standards here, and we want to lead the world. But Norway and the UK in particular both had some very serious accidents, and as a result of that, revamped their regulatory systems. And in fact, Our separation of the regulatory side from the enforcement side is something that both countries have done and
Right.
did after their accident. So we want to learn from them. We're in that process, and we need to continue it.
Last question I have, the staff is, we've looked at the language that makes the definition of the high-risk well. Their thoughts are that it would, in fact, the definition would capture all offshore oil and gas rigs and could potentially capture all onshore oil and gas rigs as well. Is that your understanding of the definition?
We'd want to study the definition more. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we need more time to study. There certainly is a differentiation among risks in terms of well, with pressures and temperatures and that sort of thing. But we don't have a view on the definition in your bill at this point.
And how long might you take to come up with a conclusion on that?
We'd be happy to follow up informally at the staff level in terms of getting and are available to do that at any time.
Okay.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On April 30th, the President directed the Secretary of Interior to conduct a review of the Deepwater Horizon disaster and provide recommendations on additional precautions and technologies that should be required to improve the safety of offshore oil and gas operations. This 30-day report was delivered to the President on May 27th. We're working to craft legislation with the same goal of improving safety, and the 30-day report has helped inform our efforts, as you know. The report has several recommendations related to ensuring the effectiveness of the blowout preventer. These devices are supposed to be a fail-safe way of preventing blowouts from occurring. Mr. Hayes, one of the recommendations in the report was that blowout preventers should be required to have 2 sets of blind shear rams spaced at least 4 feet apart. Why is that important?
That's important, Congressman, because the blind shear rams, which are designed to cut through a pipe, through the drill pipe in an emergency where you have to just get complete closure, they have the potential to hit the joint between the casing strings. And if they hit the joint, they won't be able to shear through. If you have them separated by 4 feet, you're sure to get an area of the pipe that is outside the joint interval.
We agreed with that provision, and we thought we needed to make sure at least one set of blind shear rams could cut through and seal the pipe, so we included that as a minimum requirement in our bill. The 30-day report also includes recommendations that embrace the concept of third-party certification of blowout preventers. Why does the department think this is a good approach?
Well, it's an approach, Congressman, that actually has been taken in other jurisdictions. Norway, UK, for example, take that approach. We think it helps ensure that the industry is not simply self-regulating and/or dependent upon government inspectors. That there's an additional enforcement mechanism. And interestingly, we are already imposing some of that under the notice to lessees that we sent out, the safety notice to lessees that we sent out earlier this month. And there's a lot of activity, and it seems to the industry folks recognize the significance of it, or so they've told us. So we think it's an important step.
We agreed with all the things you said, and we also thought that that it'll help ensure blowout preventers are properly designed for the well, and that it's properly maintained. So we have that requirement that they be certified by an independent third party before drilling begins and every 6 months after that. Another key issue is well design and cementing procedures. The 30-day report emphasizes the need for new rules for casing installation and cementing. What do you see as the weaknesses of the current regulation regarding well design and cementing?
Well, on the cementing side, I'm not yet a petroleum engineer, but there are a variety of question marks regarding the type of cement that is used, the time of the curing of the cement, the expectation in terms of how far up and down the annulus the cement job has to fall. There are views that there could be weaknesses in all of those aspects. And we are doing an emergency rulemaking to help develop standards in that regard. Similar with regard to the well design, there are concerns about single string casing for certain types of wells. The same types of issues, Congressman, that your bill is addressing.
Mm-hmm. Well, we took that recommendation and provided that there be a third-party certification of an oil company's casing designs and cementing procedures in order to maintain well control. We also require cement bond log tests to ensure that defective cement jobs are detected before it's too late, something we wished BP had done.
Indeed.
And they could have done, but they didn't. We appreciate all your efforts to improve the safety of offshore drilling, and we'll look forward to working with you and our colleagues to be sure that we do the best we can to learn from the experience, prevent it from ever happening again, leave enough flexibility so as new technologies are designed, you have the flexibility to accommodate those concerns, but not just delegate the authority to the companies to make the decisions on their own, which could lead to them cutting costs and cutting corners at the same time. Thank you. Yield back my time.
Chair recognizes Mr. Barton for 5 minutes.
Thank the distinguished subcommittee chairman there. It's good to see you in the chair as opposed to on the baseball field last night. Chairman Markey asked some questions about existing authority versus new authority. What authority that you don't have do you need statutorily in this bill?
Congressman, we think we have the authority we need to develop a more robust regulatory system, but we're happy to work with the committee, as Chairman Markey suggested, to help identify minimum standards.
Okay, I understand that. I think the Republicans are open to giving new authority where necessary, but I want to clarify. You could, to use your phrase, develop new robust standards without existing new statutory authority. Is that not true?
That's true. I will say that another aspect of the bill is to increase the penalties for failure to meet the regulatory standards, and we've testified in elsewhere that we're open to increasing those penalties.
And Mr. Upton asked some questions about the definition of high risk. As currently drafted, it could be interpreted to apply to almost any well drilled onshore or offshore. Is that not true?
I unfortunately can't comment on that, but we understand the importance of having a solid definition of high risk. There are differentiations among wells, and we'd be happy to work with a committee.
For example, would the current definition of high risk or the lack of definition of high risk in the pending draft, could it apply to wells that are on private land or state land onshore?
I can't comment, Congressman.
You can't comment that it could or it couldn't, or you just won't comment?
No, I need to review that. I'm not trying to be evasive, Congressman. I need to review the language more closely.
Do you agree that before we legislate, we should have a definition that is clear and precise and easily understood?
I do.
Okay. That's a good answer.
Okay.
That's a good answer. Okay. Does the Department of Interior have a position on drilling in the OCS?
In terms of a moratorium, is that what?
Well, no, I'm not to the moratorium yet.
Okay.
Is it the official? Is there an official position on generic drilling in the OCS, and if so, what is it?
We support drilling in the OCS in accordance with the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. Yes.
All right. If that's the position, do you or the administration agree that legislation that is passed to deal with the oil spill should still make it possible to drill in the OCS?
Well, I mean, the predicate, of course, to our statement is that the drilling can proceed in a safe and environmentally sound manner, and we are open to legislative improvements that would help assure that result.
But I think it's clarifying for the administration and the committee to understand that everybody wants to drill safely, environmentally, protectively, but if you set the standards and the regulations so strenuously or tightly, it is at least conceivable that you can end up not getting any drilling, and that means we would be even more dependent on foreign sources of energy. So the key for the committee and the administration is to tighten up where necessary, clarify where necessary, do everything necessary to prevent, if possible, a reoccurrence of what happened ever again, but still make it possible to generate the domestic energy that's beneath the waters of the OCS that helps our citizenry on shore. You agree with that?
As a general matter, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Dingle for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As one of the two authors of NEPA, which I co-sponsored way back with my old friend Scoop Jackson, I am troubled about the fact that here the agency appears to have required a full EIS with regard to the overall leasing, but not with regard to the particular well. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Is that going to be a continuing practice, or are you going to see to it now that you have environmental impact statements issued on each well?
We are in the midst of a very intense evaluation of that issue with the council.
That statute, I'll tell you that it requires you to do this where there's going to be an impact upon the environment. And I think as you look about you will see it has had an enormous impact on the environment and a political impact on everybody concerned. And I want you to know that I'll make that political impact considerably worse if you don't engage in the practice of seeing to it that you have environmental impact statements filed on each one of these deep water wells, because the consequences are, quite frankly, horrific. Now, if you did not do so on the Macondo well, will you please submit the rationale for the record?
Certainly.
And also submit for the record statutory authority under which categorical exclusions were granted. Were there any statutory bases for the exclusion or not?
There was a regulatory basis. The Council on Environmental Equality has a rule that applies here.
Please submit that.
We will.
Now, how many categorical exclusions under NEPA were granted for drilling projects in the OCS? You can submit that for the
I will. We will.
Apparently a substantial number. Now, Section 3 of the discussion draft before us requires redundant sets of shear rams on the wells. I happen to think that's a good idea, but I have a great apprehension, and that is that this may in some way stall, slow, or prevent development of even better and newer technology. How are we to address that concern?
I think you raise a very important point, Congressman. We are interested in triggering a complete reevaluation of the technology for blowout preventers, and certainly with today's blowout preventers, duplication of the shear rams makes great sense. But query whether there isn't better technology that can be brought to the table, and we're very open to and expect to be evaluating that. And we to your point, we hope that legislation will not inhibit the ability to move with technology and move beyond the current approach.
Any regulations that you issue pursuant to that, I hope will encourage rather than inhibit that process. Now, as I see the way you ought to do this, first of all, you need to gather full information for the proper decision-making process. Then you need to assure that the development of the well is done safely, including safe development. Then I see that you need to engage rather specifically here in prevention of failures, because prevention is a lot easier to do than cleaning up some damnable mess that's created. Then I see that you have to have on hand an adequate and quick response to failure. I note here that there was no adequate quick response. And I note that there were no cleanup plans. And I note that there does not appear to have been constant reviews of practices and developments and new technology as you went forward. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
I agree that there's a three-legged stool. There's the safety and prevention aspect of this that we are working on. There's the containment issue if a spill occurs that has not traditionally gotten enough attention. And there's the spill cleanup requirement that clearly needs attention.
In your regulations, are you going to make an effort to see to it that the regulations do reflect those concerns? And if you will, please, tell us what in what fashion this legislation does not ensure that those steps are taken, because we want to see to it that if we do this, it's done well.
Well, I do note that your Section 2 has performance standards in your legislation that deal with all three of these issues, and that strikes me as a very appropriate approach. In terms of what we are doing on the containment side, it's part of our 30-day report is a suggestion that we are following through on evaluating how to be much more prepared for this eventuality, which despite hopeful thinking that this cannot occur, it obviously can occur, and we need to be better prepared.
Now, my time is ending, so I have to get this question in. You did not have a quick and adequate response to the failure which occurred. And I do not believe that you had adequate cleanup plans which placed proper burdens upon the company that did the drilling. Are you making steps to change that and to see to it that proper actions are taken in that regard, both with regard to existing leases and coming up leases?
Yes, sir.
Would you give us a statement as to what you're doing there and how it is progressing so that the committee can have a look at that, please?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'd recognize Mr. Scalise for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hayes, are you familiar with the 30-day report that was conducted by the Department of Interior?
Yes,
to
sir.
Come up with recommendations. And they had come up with a number of specific safety recommendations. Have you looked at those safety recommendations and implemented any of those?
Yes, sir.
Which ones?
We implemented 5 specific safety recommendations in the June 8th notice to lessees.
Are you
Actually,
familiar?
I'm sorry, it's more than 5. More like 8 or 10.
Okay. Are you familiar with their concerns about the moratorium issued by Secretary Salazar? Specifically, and I know a majority of that panel that was put together, those scientists, those engineers, a majority of them actually said that this moratorium implemented by the Secretary would reduce safety. Are you familiar with those concerns that they expressed?
There were concerns expressed by some of the reviewers.
A majority of them.
The question of the proposed the concept that there was a higher risk associated with the drilling moratorium was not endorsed that by a number of those folks.
But a majority did say that. A majority actually said that this moratorium would decrease safety. Are you aware of that, first of all? A majority of the panel put together by the Secretary.
We had a number of these folks in the office with the Secretary. There was not unanimity on that point by the folks who were visiting with us.
Yeah, but a majority signed a letter, and I don't know if you saw the letter, but a majority of the scientific panel you put together, the actual experts that you assembled, said that the moratorium would decrease safety. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware of the letter.
Okay, well, I would hope y'all would go back and look at that, because many of us are concerned that not only does it hurt economically to have this moratorium, but it actually will reduce safety, and there are very specific reasons they cited for those reductions in safety. And if we're concerned, as I am, about increasing safety, then the Secretary should be very concerned that his own moratorium actually would decrease safety on offshore drilling as recommended by his own panel that he put together, a majority of those members. So I would hope you would go back and look at that. But going back to the actual report on safety, but specifically about the bill that we've got before us, can you tell me in the bill which provisions would actually help us cap the well right now? Which provisions in this bill will actually help us cap the well?
I think this committee is more familiar with the bill than we are.
You read the bill?
In terms of...
Have you read the bill, Mr.
Yes, I have read the bill, Congressman.
Do you know of any sections that would increase our likelihood of capping the well?
Section 2 has a performance standard that requires containment.
That requires containment, not related to this well, though. Well, can you tell me then in the bill, where does it actually have any provisions that help us battle the oil and keep it off of our coast today, which we're battling with every day, we've been battling with for over 2 months?
Well, Section 2 says that their oil response plans need to be revised. There has to be an assurance the BOP will work.
Well, and that's nice for down the road, but that doesn't help us today. And I mean, I'm just pointing out, the title of this hearing is Legislation to Respond to the BP Oil Spill. And yet, I don't see anything in this bill that actually helps us address the problems we're dealing with today. Now, I know some members are scrambling around to try to defend this administration's failures, but if you actually go and talk to the leaders on the ground, the people who are battling that oil every day, they will tell you that they're spending more time fighting the federal government's incompetence than they are battling the oil. That's inexcusable. Yet that's still happening today. We're not talking about something that happened in the first couple of weeks that's been resolved. Just last week, we had 2 more very clear examples of efforts where our leaders were trying to battle the oil, and they were being blocked not by BP, but by the federal government. And so, maybe some people that want to defend the administration would be better served to actually go down to the Gulf and go meet with those leaders and help us. We want to help solve the problems on the ground. And I know this bill's got all kind of things, and I'd like to ask you about some of the specific things that are very undefined that literally would allow to complete elimination of drilling, not just offshore, but also onshore. But we want to be focused on actually solving the problems that we're battling with that are holding back our leaders today from dealing with this crisis, the worst national disaster, this worst national environmental disaster probably in the country's history. And we're spending more time fighting the federal government. I don't see anything in this bill that helps us give our local leaders the tools we need to fight the battles today. Now, we also need to be focused on fighting battles tomorrow. But if this hearing's titled Legislation to Respond to the BP Oil Spill, you would think we'd be spending some time focusing on that problem that we're battling every day right now, and unfortunately so many times against the federal government, which there is no excuse for. And hopefully in the second round we'll have a chance to get into that. I know I'm out of time, so I yield back.
The witness, if you'd like to respond to that at all, you have a reasonable period to do so, Mr. Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The federal response working with the states is unprecedented in scope. Throughout the administration, we are working every hour of every day incredibly intensely to try to deal with this problem. There are daily calls with the governors. there's I've been to the Gulf multiple times, as is every senior administration official in every affected agency. One would not expect this bill to have anything to do with the current response. We are proceeding with the current response under current authority and throwing everything we have at it, and I resent the implication that we are not.
Well, you need to go talk to the local leaders then, because they'll tell you exactly what's going wrong that is not being addressed to this day. We want those problems fixed.
Mr. Scalise, thank you for your interruption of the witness, but we need to move on.
He's made some statements that weren't accurate.
Are you done, Mr. Scalise? We'd like to proceed with the hearing. Is that okay with you? Thank you very much. We appreciate your courtesy, so we can get on with this. Mr. Green, are you prepared?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think your answers to some of the questions earlier from other members, Department of Interior feels like they have the authority right now under current law to do the best you can in not only dealing with what's going on now, but also into the future. Do you think the Department of Interior has the ability to provide regulations on, redundancies, on blowout preventers, on inspection systems? Is there anything stopping Department of Interior from right now going and investigating every well in the Gulf of Mexico, if you have the staff to do it, that is?
There is nothing stopping us, and we are redoubling and tripling our efforts along those lines, Congressman.
Okay, and I understand the nature of this bill is to give additional authority and something we can look at, and so I know the draft we have is still a work in progress, and it's going to take a lot of work. I appreciate any suggestions from Interior, because I've been working on legislation for a good while and on separate issue, and we submit it to agencies for their response, and it's really helpful. So if you would. I also want to comment, and I don't expect you to respond to it, but because I know the Department of Interior should be the lead agency in dealing with offshore development. And whether it's in consultation with the EPA or in consultation with any other agency, the Department of Interior should be the agency. And if we can beef it up on any way reasonable, I want to help. And I think anyone who represents areas along the Gulf Coast want to do that, because that's our jobs and our tax base. And one of the issues I have, and I don't know if you have the information, we've been working with both Department of Interior and the new sub-agency, I guess, and the 66-month moratorium did not cover shallow wells. And I know we've been meeting on a weekly basis with conference calls with both industry and members of Congress. And I was just told, and I was going to see, if there have been any, since the shallow well is 500 feet or less, up until last week, there were no permits issued. And I understand in the last week there have been. If you don't have it, if you could get it back to the committee on what's happening, because my fear is that not only are we having a 6-month moratorium on deep water wells, but de facto moratorium on shallow wells where we do produce a lot of our natural gas.
Right.
Do you have any personal information about any permits have been issued since Horizon for shallow water drilling permits?
I know that there is. I don't have the exact information, but I know that there are a number of permits now that are mature and that we are looking to process. We had a notice to lessees about 10 days ago requiring some additional information from folks on blowout scenarios, and that information has been coming in. And once that information is in, the APD decisions can be made, and so we talked about this with a group of industry folks at the department just a couple of days ago. We expect more shallow water drilling APDs to be granted in the near future.
Okay.
There is no moratorium on shallow water, and we want to move it through, but we were requiring that operators meet the new safety requirements that are laid out in the 30-day report. That has been broadly supported by industry, and we had folks in, as I say, a couple days ago that confirmed that. And then there was this important gap in terms of the exploration plans of having a description of the blowout scenarios, and that's being filled now. And that will, the combination of those two things will enable those permits to continue to be granted.
Okay. My next question would be, I know the bill talks about a high-risk well, And with the thousands of wells that have been drilled without any problems, I would hope that, do you have a suggestion on what a high-risk well would be? Obviously, from what happened in Horizon, it would be a deep water well, 5,000 feet or more. But again, shallow water wells or landside wells seem like they have a pretty good safety record. Is that the experience from the Department of Interior?
The historic record in terms of blowouts has been generally good, but obviously the implications of an uncontrolled blowout are horrendous, as we're seeing now. We're happy to work with the committee to help define relative risk among wells. There certainly are some criteria that could be utilized, and we have a lot of expertise in the agency that might be useful as you proceed.
Mr. Chairman, just one more. I know there's, in Texas and Oklahoma, there are lots of wells that are called stripper wells. They're very low producing wells, maybe 10 or 12 barrels a day. And of course, when it's $150 a barrel, it's really great. But it's at 60, there were times at $8 and $10, it wasn't hardly worth the electricity to produce it. I would surely hope that there would be some reasonableness in those type of wells that produce a great deal for our country would not be considered high risk. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about third-party verification. When we mentioned that we lifted the moratorium on shallow water, that is dependent on that third party of verification of the safety requirements.
Mm-hmm.
What is the approximate cost for a third-party verification? Do we have a number that would be applicable to the cost for this independent contractor to do a verification?
I'm not sure. Steve, do you know?
I don't know the cost.
If you can find that, we would appreciate having that. The second thing is this independent contractor immune from any liability should something happen after the certification is given? Is there a liability to this independent contractor? And I'd appreciate knowing that as well. And are they bonded, and what are the limits of their liability after they verify? The second thing is, how many of these independent contractors are out there, and if we're going to require an independent contractor to verify the safety, to allow drilling to go forward, the number of those, the cost to the industry, their liability, are they bonded? That's an important concept, because in fact, if there are not enough independent contractors that are willing to verify, that are willing to inspect, sign their signature, put their company at risk, then in fact that moratorium is still in place if there are not enough out there. So I'd appreciate knowing that as well.
Congressman Griffith, I'll attempt to answer that now to the extent I can, and we'd be happy to follow up with additional information. As you point out, the first safety NTL does require certain third-party verifications. The Minerals Management Agency, now the Bureau of Offshore Energy, has provided clarification with respect to each of the points you raise, has made clear that the third party must have adequate bonding or insurance and must have the requisite engineering experience to review whatever it is being verified. So far, the industry has not expressed any concern or problem finding those third-party validators. They are contractors, consultants that do this on a routine basis. So they are available, and to my knowledge at least, this has not been a problem so far.
So it wouldn't be an impediment to the moratorium. It would be something that would be, we're ready to take that on. We've got plenty of independent contractors, and the cost is not prohibitive, or we'll check into that.
Yes, sir.
The other thing that I persistently hear is that Norway and the United Kingdom, that have had similar problems, have developed techniques for removing oil from water that are far superior to the ones that we might be using in the Gulf. Is there any truth to that, and are we making an effort to get their equipment into the Gulf that they say is superior to ours, that are BPs that are being used now? Is that a rumor? Is there any factual information about that?
Mr. Griffith, I'm not aware of the technology that you're referring to. I know, obviously, Kevin Costner has offered some solutions along those lines. I'm not an expert or a petroleum engineer in that, and so I don't have an answer to your question.
So, so the rumor continues. Okay, I hear you. The other thing is that it sounds like to me from the questions that have been asked and some proposals that have been made that it would be in our best interest as far as the United States is concerned and its energy resources that we have a greater amount of information before we finalize a bill. Would that be fair? Would you be more comfortable with more information and more investigation, since it's an ongoing investigation? And you've mentioned that you've got the regulatory authority to do pretty much what you want to do now without a bill. So is there really a hurry for us to do a bill without completing the investigation?
Congressman, we'll leave it to the Congress to decide what's appropriate. What we are doing is, even before we get the final root cause figured out, we are moving to shore up safety issues that we think do need some attention.
Okay. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Mr. Hayes, Mr. Scalise took some political shots at the administration. I guess that comes with the territory, but I want to ask you about the response that is going on, because we all across the country want to be that as vigorous as humanly possible, given the suffering of the folks in the Gulf right now. I'm told that as of the beginning of this week, the Obama administration has mobilized over 40,000 people to fight the spill. There are 7,200 vessels today that are fighting the spill. I'm told that the administration has also authorized the deployment of 17,500 National Guard troops to respond to the disaster in 4 affected states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. However, I'm told that only the governors of the respective states can actually deploy them. And thus far, although the President has authorized the use of 17,500 National Guards troops, those governors have only deployed 1,675 troops. Is in fact that the situation, and in fact, is it the governors who have the ability to deploy those troops?
Congressman, that's my understanding, although I will caveat that the Department of the Interior is not the lead in terms of that issue.
So, given the needs, shouldn't these governors deploy these troops that the federal administration has authorized to be used? If, in fact, Mr. Scalise is right, there's not an adequate response, why don't the governors authorize the deployment of these troops?
Would the gentleman yield?
No. And the reason I won't yield is because you didn't respect the witnesses in the time that we had. So, Mr. Hayes, go ahead.
That is not accurate.
I am not comfortable speaking to the question of the potential benefit of the National Guard in terms of the governor's requests. I do know that the administration has been supportive of requests to employ the National Guard. As to why they're not being utilized, I'm not sure. I do know, per your general point, that the governors, the parish presidents, the other local folks in Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, and the federal folks have a massive joint response effort underway under the framework law that this Congress passed in 1990 to respond to this oil spill. It is an enormous challenge because this oil has continued to leak into the Gulf at a huge rate for now a very long time.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think it would be helpful if we had bipartisan teamwork to try to figure out how to force the oil industries to have adequate spill response plans so we wouldn't be behind the curve as we have been in this situation trying to play catch-up. And if we had a little more teamwork from the other side of the aisle to figure out how to pass a law to prevent this from happening, of people trying to make things up as they go along because the industry didn't have an adequate spill response plan, then maybe we could be in a better position if this were to happen again. I hope we have that kind of teamwork. I want to ask you about going forward to try to prevent the next tragedy. my view is that we ought to have the same level of assurance to prevent this tragedy as we do in the aviation industry. And I think the FAA is a pretty good template to look to try to design a regulatory system to prevent that. I've been talking to some folks in the FAA, and what they tell me is that they set a standard of performance that you have to have. You can't expect, for instance, a loss of control of your airplane to happen more than 1 in a billion instances of takeoffs. And the industry then is expected to propose and provide an engineering analysis to say that that expectation will be met.
Mm-hmm.
Shouldn't we have something similar in this situation as to each and every critical system of offshore drilling? Shouldn't we design in this third-party mechanism an expectation in something in that regard?
I think an expectation of a very high standard of safety is necessary and appropriate.
So in this third-party mechanism, should we have an expectation that they set a level of statistical performance that the engineers have to show will be met? Shouldn't that be something we put in the statute?
I think potentially we're open to working with you on that, Congressman.
Next question, should we be using the best available technology? And it is probably an amendment I will be offering to require the best available technology to be used. Is that something you think would be a good idea?
Certainly for this deep water drilling situation, yes, Congressman.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the panelists. Sorry I haven't been here, as many of us filter in and out, but let me first yield some time to my colleague from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
I thank the gentleman from Illinois for yielding, and one of our other members listed off, and we hear too often all this, litany of things that are being done when they try to defend the failed response on the ground by the federal government, and we've got this deployed and that deployed. Just give you an opportunity, Mr. Hayes, to address one of the issues that we battled last week with the sand barrier plan.
Sure.
This is a plan that the president just a week and a half ago bragged about in his national address, bragged about approving. He only approved 25% of the governor's plan to build a sand barrier protection that we had wanted to protect the marsh.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we'd submitted that plan 3 weeks prior to the approval when there was no oil in the marsh, and now there is. But last week, an agency in your department shut that plan down for almost a week. Why these kind of bureaucratic delays?
Well, that specific situation was because the state and its contractor was violating the permit agreement that had been provided the basis for it. And we're happy to supply record information about this, but there was an agreement as to where the sand could be taken from, because if it was taken from the wrong spot, we would not have the Chandelier Islands, and you would take away the ability to maintain that island system.
Well, that's not accurate. According to our state's Coastal Protection Authority, which runs this, they had a permit from the Corps of Engineers to go and get that borrowed sand. They actually had,
but not from the location. What the contractor requested on a temporary basis, waiting for piping to take sand from a location that was not permitted, the federal government said, we will give you let you do this for 4 or 5 days, no more, because at that point the integrity of the island system will be affected. They did that for 4 or 5 days and then asked for another 10 days of taking sand from an area that was not allowed in the permit. At that point, the Fish and Wildlife Service, backed up by the Corps of Engineers, said, no, you have to agree to the permit conditions that you agreed to at the outset of this project, and that's what happened.
Well, and unfortunately, they had the permit from the Corps. It took them over 3 weeks to get the permit. This comes in, shuts the project down for almost a week. I think it was 5 or 6 days. Shut the project down. Well, they had to go back and forth and fight with y'all. And and you can have all your reasons about what you're concerned about. They're concerned about protecting the coast from stopping these pelican nests from being destroyed, which they're being destroyed. But you can have your bureaucratic haggling back and forth.
It's more than a bureaucratic issue, Mr. Congressman.
Let me ask you this, because we just heard all this bragging about all these vessels deployed. Just a few weeks ago, the vessels that were supposed to be out skimming for oil were sitting idle at the dock, not skimming for oil, again, as oil was coming into the marsh. Now, I don't know if you have any explanation for that, but I mean, it's just over and over we get, and I'm sure you've got good reasons why you think you should hold on to and pull back permits that were issued or want to change plans. But
if I can please,
If the gentleman, if I can,
and I'll
reclaim my
yield to the
time,
gentleman from
and,
Illinois.
I did want to give my colleague and friend time to rebut. I think part of the frustration is, I mean, we're all frustrated about this whole mess that we're in,
right.
And I think the executive branch would have done itself well if they would have went to the locals and said, locals, what do you need? And deployed. And then I know it's, in fact, I've told my friend from Louisiana, I probably would have done it without federal permits. If the locals said these marshes had to be protected, do that. And I think public opinion in their states, they would have scored sky high. But that's the emotion involved. Let me just put my comments on the record on the mark. So the chairman understands concerns. 200 miles means everything. Getting a good definition for high-risk well. What is a high-risk well? Is every well a high-risk well? I don't think so. Onshore and offshore, we have onshore instances. I have marginal oil wells. Does that mean they're going to go into my cornfield now and deal with marginal oil wells that produce a barrel a day that people get royalties on? And the civil action, if we had the civil action aspect that's in this mark, we probably, Mr. Chairman, would not have the $20 billion BP settlement, because they would have had to hold their money to be prepared to fight these lawsuits. So I just put that on the record, Mr. Chairman. We look forward to working with you, and I yield back my time.
Okay, great. We thank the gentleman very much. Just for the record, the citizen suit provision exists under existing law, so it's not anything that we're adding. It is existing law. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hayes, thank you for being here and for your daily efforts to stop the leak, to contain the spill, and to deal with the aftermath. I just want to make a real quick comment before I turn to you to substantiate what my colleague from Washington said earlier, and that was that in the early days of the spill, the Defense Department did approve the state of Louisiana's request for 6,000 National Guard troops, but according to a CBS News report, the governor of Louisiana has only to this date deployed 1,053 of the National Guard to fight the spill. And the National Incident Commander, Thad Allen, has said, and this is a quote, "There's nothing standing in the governor's way from using more National Guard troops." Now, Mr. Hayes, one of the main functions of our government is to make sure that activities that pose a high risk to the health and safety of Americans and to our environment comply with basic requirements. If a company's building a skyscraper, there's an engineering and construction requirement in place to protect the people who work in that building and who walk on the streets below. We don't let an airplane fly without meeting numerous safety and security regulations. So it's no surprise that drilling for oil and gas off our shores carries with it the responsibility to meet some basic requirements. The Blowout Prevention Act starts with a basic common sense requirement. To get a federal permit to drill a high-risk well, an oil company has to demonstrate three things. And the first one is that they have to show that its blowout preventer and well control equipment will actually prevent a blowout from occurring. Mr. Hayes, would you agree that companies drilling in U.S. waters should have the effective blowout preventers that are going to work when they're needed?
Absolutely.
And do you want to explain, or do you want to say a sentence about that? Or
well, I think that we're seeing the horrific result of not having adequate oversight and regulatory requirements in place with the BP oil spill, and we must not let that happen again. I fully endorse your proposition that there are some activities that folks look to and expect the government to address, and this is the type of activity that without oversight one cannot count on self-regulation to deal with such a dangerous situation in an acceptable way.
So for the government to require a demonstration that the equipment works, that's
Yes,
number one.
yes. Demonstration of design, appropriate design, and then appropriate operation and continued inspection and testing throughout the life of the equipment.
Second, the company needs an oil spill response plan that demonstrates a capacity to promptly stop a blowout if the blowout preventer fails. In other words, what's the backup mechanism? This clearly hasn't happened in the Gulf. BP just wasn't prepared to stop a runaway well. Even when the BOP didn't function, they had no backup plan. The last 2 months has been a series of improvised, I mean, we've all watched it daily, long shot responses. I mean, just ranging from to the absurd. Rex Tillerson, the CEO of ExxonMobil, admitted to a congressional panel that the oil industry is not well equipped to deal with a blowout. So, Mr. Hayes, would you agree that companies drilling in U.S. waters have a basic obligation to be ready to stop a blowout if the blowout preventer fails? That this is the second level of a requirement that should be in place for all industries.
I absolutely agree, and as someone who lives this day in and day out and is tracking and engaged in the continued efforts of containment, I agree with an exclamation point.
Good. We'll note the exclamation point. The third requirement for getting a permit to drill is that the company must be able, and this is part of the legislation that's before us, the company must be able to show it has the capacity to begin drilling a relief well within 15 days of a blowout and to complete a relief well within 90 days. 3 months is a long time to have a well spewing oil into the sea. If an oil company is not able to demonstrate that it has the capacity to drill a relief well in that time frame, I don't see how they can claim that their operations are safe. I'd like to have you comment on this. What do you think about this, Mr. Hayes? Do you think it makes sense to require a company seeking to drill an offshore well to show that it can drill a relief well in a timely manner? And this would be that third backup as a last resort.
I think certainly in a timely manner there needs to be that capability, and it is, of course, what we're relying on right now
We really
for
have
the
no
BP oil
guarantee, do
spill.
we, that this plan, this well that's being dug, is actually even going to function.
There's no guarantee. I will say the best minds in the world are working on this to make sure this relief well does, in fact, plug the well.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes.
Great. Thank you, gentlelady. There are roll calls which apparently are going to go off approximately at 12:45. So I think we might be able to get all three remaining members in and their questions. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Hayes, thank you for being here with us. Let me just clarify, when you were answering the gentlelady from California's questions, her first requirement to you was that the blow-up preventers work. Is that not a requirement today?
It is.
So you're not just asking that someone put down a sham blow-up protector that we never expect to work. Is that correct?
No, that's right. I mean, there is a performance standard in the regulations today for blowout preventers, but we think the regulations can be improved and enforcement can be improved.
Let me ask you a question. This whole bill that we have before us is the Blowout Prevention Act, and the one piece of information, of course, that this committee and no committee can get right now is the detailed description of what went wrong with the blowout protector that's down 5,000 feet below the ocean surface. I recommended to the chairman that we subpoena the blowout protector, and he said it wouldn't fit in the room. So we're going to make recommendations, or we're actually going to legislate to prevent something from happening to a blowout preventer, which we don't know what happened, and so we can't possibly know how to prevent the preventer from misfiring in the future. I mean, that's a very difficult task. Do you have any particular insight from your position within the department that would allow you to help us craft that legislation without knowing what's wrong with the one that's down there?
Well, you certainly have a good point, Congressman, in that we don't know exactly what happened with this particular blowout preventer. We do know, though, however, as part of our follow-up from this incident, that there are some weaknesses in the regulatory structure, some of which are addressed in your bill.
And there's no question, we through the multiple hearings we've had, and
right.
Unfortunately we don't get many chances to talk to the regulators, but through the multiple hearings we've had, there was a mistake made with just the human direction on the platform, and not calling a cessation of activities when they realized that this well was very dangerous, and certainly that could have even happened several hours before the final scenes played out. There's a problem with the blowout protector, which we don't know what it is. Now, when they went down to do the infamous kill shot, they had to stop. And we've not really gotten good information on why they had to stop, but you keep hearing things about thief channels and cracked casings. And of course, there were problems, we believe, with the cementing that occurred on the well, such that if you actually were successful with a kill shot, you might blow out the blowout preventer. Is that correct?
The concern, yes, in terms of the concern was that there may not be well integrity down below the surface.
Let me ask you this.
Yes.
If we had a functioning blowout protector on that day that fired and stopped the flow of oil at the wellhead, would we still have had the problems beneath the surface potentially that could have led to a much more serious problem?
That's a very important open question.
Well, and then let me ask you this: we're writing legislation to alter the way you do things, and we don't even know if the legislation we're writing might create a greater problem than we have to deal with today. That is an open crater on the bottom of the seafloor, discharging oil until the reservoir is depleted.
Well, I would just say that part of the legislation and part of what we're doing also deals with well design, and to the extent there may have been a loss of integrity below the surface, it may well have been due to a poor well design.
And let me ask you a question about that, because the interruption of the cement bond log that was to be carried out, they were there, the people who do that sort of work were there at the rig. Why did they leave?
I don't know, sir.
Did they leave because of concerns for their safety?
I truly don't know. I do know that and every other fact around it are part of the ongoing investigation.
You know, there's so many things that have come up as a result of the questions today. I do hope we have other opportunities to visit, and I do hope we have a chance to have the Secretary here. You worked in a previous administration?
I did.
And what was your capacity in the previous administration?
For the last year and a half of the Clinton administration, I was the Deputy Secretary.
So this sort of activity would have come under your purview.
Yes.
At that time. Was there any point where you felt that you did not have the tools you needed to manage what you were asked to manage? Was there any point at which you said, boy, I wish I had this so that the Deepwater Horizon type accident wouldn't occur?
I think back then, much like I think all of us, I certainly was unaware that there was a potential serious issue here. I will note that deepwater drilling really just started in the late 90s, and that
under your watch.
Yes, with the encouragement of the Congress and incentives, deepwater drilling began really in the late 90s and then accelerated as the technology accelerated through the last decade.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'm told that the roll calls are going off in the next 3 to 8 minutes. So I think we can recognize the two members and recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson.
Thank you, Chairman Markey. Mr. Hayes, we're here today talking about this proposed legislation to look at enhancing or changing our existing set of rules and regulations to better prevent something like this from happening in the future. One question that I seem to anecdotally get different answers to is, if we look at our existing set of rules and regulations, are there other countries in the world that have sets of rules or regulations that are different from the ones of the United States that perhaps are stronger? Are you familiar with other countries' deep water well regulations?
Generally speaking, yes, I'm familiar with them, and I think it's hard to compare systems one against the other. Ironically, some of the systems that folks look at for guidance and potential emulation, like the UK and Norway, tend to not have as much prescriptive requirements in them. They tend to be performance standard based, but with systems in place to ensure those performance standards will be met. I think we can learn from each other, and we need to both have better performance standards, but also prescriptive standards where appropriate.
To the extent they're different standards, do you think that they're stronger than what we have in this country, weaker, or is it apples and oranges?
Well, personally, the sense I have is that, for example, the UK and Norway have put in place perhaps better systems at this point than we have, and that's unacceptable. We need to be leading the world here in terms of safety.
This is very interesting. I was in a science committee hearing sometime this month, maybe late May, but I think it was this month, and someone from MMS didn't think there was any difference with others around the world, but I'd heard there was, so that's why I wanted to get this question from you. And it seems to me that it would be prudent for us to take a look at these other systems that are used around the world. If we're talking about changing what we do in this country, I think we ought to consider that. I think this committee ought to look at that. And so again, I am all for doing something to make our regulations better. I said that in my opening statement, but I'm concerned about, we're talking about marking this up tomorrow, and there may be a lot of good ideas out there from around the world that have not necessarily been considered. And I would just offer that for everyone's consideration. Mr. Hayes, the legislation, just a couple of specific things about the proposed legislation. The legislation does not specify a specific regulator, but instead refers to an appropriate federal regulator. Do you believe that the Department of Interior would be best suited to oversee the implementation of the requirements of this bill, or what other agencies would you foresee being involved?
I think the Department of the Interior is appropriate agency in that we have a workforce of about 1,700 people with substantial expertise in this area.
Okay. You've heard a lot of discussion from others about the concern about how this applies onshore, offshore. Have you been able to evaluate the legislation to determine, as it's written, what the impact would be in onshore oil and gas development? Or the process Department of Interior undertakes to permit onshore?
Right. I think they're really separate animals, if I can, Congressman. This legislation is focused on offshore well development, and we certainly look at, I will say, at the Department of the Interior, there are different, as you know, FLIPMA applies to onshore, and the offshore, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act applies to offshore. So there's certainly commonalities in terms of technology and that sort of thing, but we're focused on the offshore.
As you should be.
Yes.
And as I think we should be. But my concern is, as an unintended consequence, this legislation is going to affect onshore in ways that we haven't thought through, because we're all thinking offshore right now. And I would submit that we ought to consider what those implications would be. Mr. Chairman.
Well, Gentlemen, Joe, just
what's
one point?
I'll yield to my friend
and the issue on the onshore issue is on private property.
Right.
On private property.
One of many issues, yeah.
Right.
Public lands, too. I mean, but thank you. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back and give my colleague from Texas some time.
We thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. But quickly, let's see. And I'm not sure if someone already asked this, and I apologize if they did, because there's members of Congress that have written to the Department of Interior regarding the blanket nature, the blanket nature of the moratorium in assessing what really is the riskiest ones that are out there at a certain stage, as opposed to others that should be going forward. So when the moratorium is lifted with all of the safeguards and procedures, they will not be so handicapped in going forward in what they need to do. Are you proceeding in that fashion, and can we expect that you're going to be making a distinction among different levels of operation?
The Secretary is in the midst of considering the moratorium issue, because the court enjoined the moratorium that had been entered about a week ago, and so the Secretary is looking at all aspects of it, including relative risks associated with various types of activities.
Any idea when you may come up, arrive at some determination so that we just don't have, I understand the courts are involved and who knows where all that goes.
Well, I know that we have appealed, and the Circuit Court has established an aggressive and appropriately aggressive briefing schedule, but independently the Secretary is looking at this. on a very time-sensitive basis, we understand the importance of clarity on the issue.
And then I believe Mr. Black may give me some guidance here. And this is really old information, but this is a presentation way back June 18, 2003 regarding deep water drilling, where are we headed? And regarding the lack of proper equipment, testing, anticipation and such, and then capping a blowout. What is a blowout exactly? Because they indicate blowouts have been occurring regularly throughout the petroleum history, and then they go into the percentages. But in essence, what we had out there with Deepwater Horizon was a blowout. Would that be an accurate description?
Yes, sir. Although the investigations are not concluded, we know two things. There was a failure to control the well, and that happened as a result of a number of things, potentially. And then the hydrocarbons from the field below that well obviously escaped into the environment. That is the blowout. So the blowout preventer is designed to prevent that blowout in the event of loss of well control.
So we've had other blowouts in deep water drilling, have we not?
Yes, sir.
And they were somehow obviously capped, contained, and so on. So something worked. In those other instances, would that be accurate?
Yes. I mean, we do review in the report the history of loss of well control events throughout the world, and to varying degrees. Those have been controlled, some with a relief well, many weeks after the original blowout.
Well, let's get to the blowout preventers, because in this presentation it was very interesting. It seems that the authors of this report seem to indicate that there was no way to really simulate the conditions when it comes to deep water at those depths and such. So we can have blowout preventers, but how do we assure that they actually work? How do we simulate real conditions? Is that available today?
Congressman, that's a very important question. And as Mr. Hayes has already testified, one of the things the Secretary wants to do and that we suggest through this report is re-examine the technologies available for preventing a blowout or stopping a blowout if it occurs. Those technologies do continue to evolve, and there are a number of companies looking at that question. But as you point out, this blowout occurred at great water depth, high pressure, and obviously our experience in dealing with a blowout of this type is very limited.
Way back in 2003, and my fear is that we haven't really moved forward since 2003, is how we prevent, how we cap, how we contain. But this is one of the remarks, and maybe this is not applicable, but I believe that it is. There are many dynamic kill simulators on the market. Is that what we're talking about, dynamic kill simulators?
I don't know the answer to that question, and I believe you're referring to the MMS study that was contracted in 2003, but I would have to go back and double check.
Because there are many dynamic kill simulators on the market. Maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but I'm just figuring that how do you simulate something, and that's what they're talking about. The next sentence is, none of them fits our need. None of them fits our need. That was 2003, so I'm hoping that we've made some progress, because what you're telling me is we're not even sure we're going to be able to test these blowout preventers under real conditions. I mean, do we have the technology to even do that? So we'll never be able to really tell the American public that whatever we have in place would avoid a recurrence of what we have with Deepwater Horizon, Mr. Hayes?
There are some. I think there. In fact, we are already requiring more testing for the BP relief well for the blowout prevention mechanism. There have never been tests required for the secondary systems that come into play once you have a failure. We're now requiring those secondary systems to be tested both on the deck and subsea, and it's a very, very important addition to the regulatory arsenal that already has identified some potential issues and provides a much higher margin of safety. So to your point, I think in fact there are some inspection, certification, and testing requirements that can substantially increase our level of assurance that a blowout protector will work. That's not to say we don't also have to improve in the containment and spill response capability.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to use my last 30 seconds real quick. One of the great concerns out there with the industry is having multiple regulators. And it doesn't matter what industry it is, by the way. We're talking about that in the financial world. But there's a reason for that. And I'm not sure, and I have to look at it very carefully as to, we know that most of the responsibility would be with Interior. Mr. Hayes, you already indicated in response to Mr. Matheson's question that you believe that would be the proper place to have the authority. But there also may be, in certain instances, my understanding, where the Department of Energy and EPA would be in some sort of a default position, and I'll be talking with the chairman of the subcommittee and others on that. Any concerns regarding having multiple layers, multiple regulators?
We implement the laws that Congress requires, and we'll implement whatever you all require. We are committed simply at the Department of the Interior to upgrade and implement better safety standards for this industry. We think we have the capability to do it, and we look forward to working with you to demonstrate that.
We thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We thank the gentleman. The gentleman's time has expired. All time for questioning of this panel has been completed with the thanks of the subcommittee. We thank you, Mr. Hayes and Mr. Black. We will take a recess for as long as it takes for each member to cast the 3 votes on the House floor, and then we will reconvene to hear the testimony from the second panel. The subcommittee stands in recess. Chairman, thank you.